All right, hello. My name is Robert Morgan. I'm a game writer and I'm a narrative designer, and since last year, I'm also a digital dramaturge, whatever that is. I always start with a question, and this year the question is, how often has this happened to you? You're about 6 years old, and you're happily playing an imagination game with a fellow player. Pew, pew. You shoot your opponent with an imaginary gun, fair and square. Except no. They tell you, no, you missed. Fair enough. This is a collaborative, imaginative space. So this time, you take careful aim, announcing, I take careful aim, and you shoot, ping. They tell you their force field deflected it. I'm seeing a lot of nods. You're not playing it right. No, you're not playing it right. I'm going home. Yeah, I had an older brother, so this came up a lot. Now, did their imaginary equipment include a force field a minute ago? They didn't mention it, but then it wouldn't have made tactical sense to mention it, would it? War is deception, and today's 6-year-olds have to grow up so fast. Now, in principle, digital games are supposed to resolve this issue, right? We can all play in a space with stable, agreed-upon rules, and an algorithm somewhere determines whether each bullet reached its target. Except, of course, it rarely works like that in practice. What I want to talk about today is what happens between these two systems of play. Because in the last few years, I've been working somewhere between these two spaces. I've been making augmented reality layers of digital narrative and gameplay that are laid over the real world, in real venues and public places, with a mix of digital interactions and interactions with real-world puzzles and actors. It's a state of play that's part arbitrary system and part consensus collaborative play. Working out how to make narrative compelling in this space has been a huge challenge. But I believe it's a challenge we have to meet, because AR technology is already adding extra dimensions of gameplay and story to real places, and to people's normal lives, because reality is cheap and plentiful. The graphics are great, and it rarely glitches out. But reality is also notoriously poorly designed, with major balance issues. Our players are increasingly accustomed to shifting between realities. Today I want to talk about how to make stories that can shift realities with them. Because there's no doubt that whether it's Internet of Places, or hyperlocal content, or context-sensitive AR, or reality browsers, which is the latest buzzword I'm trying to get going, pretty soon the devices we carry or wear will be able to direct us not just from our driveway down the freeway to our destination, but to a specific platform and a specific train, a specific carriage, a specific seat, to a specific product on a specific shelf in a store. And that's to say nothing of the promise of augmented reality to allow us to tag content to the real world. The appeal is obvious. The time is coming where we'll have to deal with the fact that we're increasingly able to customize our own level of reality. It's a paradigm shift that I think will be at least as significant as the original smartphone revolution. And my ambition is to start figuring out how to use these new paradigms to tell stories that happen to take place in the real world. There's quite a lot of echo. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Okay, great. So, first off, a bit about me. I started off my career as an assistant editor at PlayStation. I ended up a lead writer and voice director on Wonderbook Book of Spells and its sequel, Book of Potions, which I wrote in collaboration with J.K. Rowling. It was an augmented reality title that came with a real paper and cardboard book in the box. And you showed the book to your PlayStation camera while sitting in your living room. And the first lesson that I learned about AR, the most important lesson really, the ones that stayed with me ever since, is that not only is the player and the protagonist kind of the same person when they're sitting in their living room with a magic spell book, looking at themselves on a camera feed and watching themselves play the game, but it's also that you have to start asking players certain kinds of questions in order to get them engaged more than they might otherwise be getting engaged in a flat screen or traditional 2D game. While players were first getting to grips with the book, we had a voice prompt that prompted them to start interacting, which asked us a question, a very simple question. Are you a wizard or not? I actually thought it was a bit much when I wrote it first. I thought that players might find it hostile. But to our surprise, in user testing, kids were shouting at the screen, yes, yes, I am a wizard. Yeah, I want to participate. It's a question everybody knows the answer to, because it's in the books. Harry gets asked this very question at the end of book 1. But more importantly, a player sitting in their living room answering this question is answering inside the fiction. It turns an idle moment, an awkward, kind of self-conscious moment, into a moment of self-definition for the player. And they define themselves inside the fiction. It's a question that helps make space for them to put on their wizard hat and robe in order to participate. And in many ways, I've been asking this same question ever since. Now, I have either 3 jobs or I have 1 job in 3 parts, depending on who you ask. I write games, specializing in VR scripts, most recently A Fisherman's Tale, which came out from Inner Space. I consult on narrative and AR and VR for various people. And for the last 3 years, I've been creative director of Playlines, and we make location-based, interactive, augmented reality theater, or, depending on who I'm talking to, mixed reality digital performance, or XR-enhanced live content, whether it's AR or MR or XR or my new favorite, merged reality. My goal has been to explore this hybrid medium, to experiment with AR's promise of delivering digital layers of adventure that players explore by navigating what, for simplicity's sake, I'm now calling the hard layer, that is, actual reality. Our goal is to build a track record of making large-scale, narrative-led AR using cheap, minimum viable technology, in this case, digital audio and real-world actors. And I want to do it without waiting for the visual technology, the visors and the holograms, without waiting until they're good enough to create complete and convincing digital fictions in the real world. I want to build a track record now. So I'm certainly not going to slow down to wait for the definitions of AR or VR or XR or whatever else to catch up. What we found is that in real-world AR adventures, where 90% of what the player experiences is the real world, digital narrative works best when you deliver just enough, just season it over the player's experience, just enough to recontextualize the real world around them, to make players relate to what they're seeing and where they're standing and where they're going in a more adventurous way. In AR, you cannot tell the player you are in the dragon's cave. It just doesn't work. But instead, we can give the player a story that takes place inside them. We can tell the player you're being watched, or just act normal. As you'll know if you've ever said this to someone at a party, you can completely change someone's relationship to the world around them, just with seasoning them with a little bit of story. This is mixed reality. And as you'll know if you've ever walked down the street, imagined it to be going pew-pew, or used a stick as a sword, or imagined enemies in the bushes, or Pokemon at the bus stop, activating a little bit of imagination goes a long way. Now, most important slide in the talk. What does all this actually mean? I have a video of our most recent installation, which was at Future Storytelling Festival in New York. It is a collaboration with a UK grime artist called Harry Shotter. This is a hip-hop experience that turned any venue into a story-driven nightclub experience. Content warning, because of the nature of the content, there is swearing, and although it is an anti-drug piece, it has a reference to drugs in it. Let's find out if the video works. Please. Let's see. Hey. Sound?
How you been? Harry Shotter's MCing in what, 20 minutes? Excuse me, mate, what room is the drum and bass?
Never mind that. You look like you're out your fucking face.
Nah, mate, just drinking. My mate here, he's sober.
Well, if I catch you with any drugs, it's game over.
Now let me tell you about yourself, you absolute waste man. Hold on, how you gonna lie to my mate? You're the same old Lucas from the estate. Hold on.
Sorry, lad, sorry. Yo, Ellie, come back. Wait, just let me talk to her,
As for you, player, I see you've made your decision. Goodbye.
Hey, man, what's happening? You don't look right. Talk to me, man. You still shook from the fight? Are you playing a joke? You want to talk of this spliff? That boy don't look right. Hey, come look at this.
So that was an installation at Future of Storytelling. We were nominated, we were finalists for their Innovation in Storytelling Prize. It was an interactive layer of music and story spread throughout a historic venue. You explored rooms, characters in the audio layer would come and talk to you, tell you where to go next, and the character that you chose to follow, the room that you chose to go to, which storylines you chose to pursue by physically navigating the venue, determined what happened in the story, and led to one of 5 different endings. And as you saw, there are interactions with real-world actors who exist both in the digital layer as a character and in the hard layer. So in that case, players received through the digital layer a password, which they then gave verbally to a bouncer to be allowed into a VIP area. Now, at its basic level, players arrive at a venue, download an app, plug in some headphones, and start exploring. We seed the venue with Bluetooth iBeacons, which we use to track the player much more accurately than GPS. And so we can start treating where the player goes as a story decision made inside the game layer. We have a game engine running in the back end, and we can track those decisions and make sure the consequences of your actions follow you through the story. This is one of our narrative design diagrams. Once we're able to deliver story directly to the player like this, we can start building up complex layers of interactive fiction, which just happen to take place in the real world. But in these experiences, the player's the site, the interface between fiction and real. Once they're on board the narrative, the player gets to decide how much is fiction and how much is real. And the story is there to help them along, because some players need more help than others, particularly if they're a bit self-conscious, if they struggle with the doofus factor. The doofus factor. Niantic themselves have identified that Pokemon Go potentially suffers from the doofus factor. When your app has a critical mass, this can actually be a good thing, because seeing other people on the street being dorky, being visibly surrounded by our fellow dorks is a really great feeling. Welcome to GDC, by the way. How's it going, everyone? It helps us all bring us out of our dorky shells. But because in Playlines we use audio, we're speaking directly to one player at a time. And we often install our fiction layers within busy festivals or public spaces to add a dimension of story or adventure, to create a population of engaged, exploring users who see the same space in a more adventurous light. But if we leave those players to get over the doofus barrier themselves without any help, at best we're limiting the number of players who will get the most out of the experience, and at worst we're excluding players who want to be part of it, but who aren't primed to do the kinds of semi-imaginative play or role-playing out on the street. In conventional play, in conventional design, we think of self-consciousness as the antithesis of immersion. The kid who does this, who keeps destabilizing the reality of collaborative play, this kid is somehow worse than the kid who always has a deflector shield. It's part of why Punch Drunk Theatre, who created Sleep No More, anonymizes their player audiences by putting masks on them. It makes players feel more free to explore environments without social cost. But in our installations, we found that achieving immersion in AR is not the same thing as chasing down and eliminating the player's self-consciousness, because we don't want to overwrite the player's identity, even if we could. And the player's self-consciousness, yes, their shyness, is part of their identity. It's a mistake to pretend the player isn't there, because in AR, the most important reality you're augmenting is the player themselves. Because, and if you've seen me speak before, you won't be surprised to learn that I think this is all about embodiment. In my VR work, I argue that what's exciting about VR is not just who you're seeing, but who you're being. The player is radically embodied in a VR scene in a way that they just aren't in any other format. And so you have an opportunity not just to give the player something cool to look at, but to show that the simulation looks back. Because embodiment comes with a lot of powerful effects, including self-consciousness. In VR, if you pretend the player isn't really present, if they're just no more than an invisible flying camera, then the player doesn't have any emotional or physical stake in the scene. They literally have no skin in the game. But in AR, the player's really standing in front of you, and they really are wondering if you're going to embarrass them or heckle them. Their feet probably hurt, and their phone is running out of battery, and they're worried about Brexit. Embodiment, the fact that they really are there, that's what's keeping them feeling like it's all real, maybe even a bit too real. And if you exclude all that from your fiction, it's a huge flashing sign to them that it isn't real, that they don't have to emotionally engage. This doesn't mean that players don't want to take part. Players want to be part of your fictions. That's why it's called willing suspension of disbelief. but it's a collaboration, and you have to meet them halfway. So how do we design interactions which allow players to merge the two realities they're dealing with? Interactions that bring the player more into the fiction, no matter what they're feeling when they're standing in the real world worried about the doofus factor. Well, the easiest example comes from working with kids, because kids are accustomed to shifting between multiple realities and changing the rules. But they're also generally not too good at playing a specific character that you give them and following the rules of that character. They'll blow right through all of that and expose exactly how much space your fiction leaves for them and their real feelings, especially boredom, especially self-consciousness. This is the Dream Finder. Anyone familiar with this character? This is a costume character at Epcot. He was part of a ride that was all about imagination. The character was originated by personal heroes, Ron Schneider. And he wrote a book about the early days of the character in the 80s, in the golden era of the autograph book. Kids were coming up, and instead of interacting as a character, instead of talking about imagination, giving him a chance to work a little bit of character magic, they just wanted an autograph and then to go. Because by and large, kids want a safe social interaction where they know they're not going to screw up, especially when confronted with somebody who's not only cool, but kind of intimidating. The character has a bubble of fiction around them. The character's trying to invite the kids in, but kids were bouncing straight off because they wanted a safe interaction behind the autograph book. And so one day, Ron started asking kids, "What are you? Why are you smaller than all of these taller people? What's a child? Explain to me what a child is." It's one of my favorite pieces of interaction design ever. Oh, it's banging. Kids love answering questions that they know the answer to, especially if an adult doesn't know the answer. The Dream Finder takes the risk. He looks silly. He's already done all of the clowning. So in comedy terms, the kid gets to be the straight man. Through this question, the performer expands and opens the bubble of fiction with an easy point of access for the kid. And it actually uses the player's own self-awareness to fuel their immersion, because it asks them to account for themselves, to explain their presence, to use their self-consciousness in a way that is now suddenly in fiction, in a way which encompasses the emotions that normally would be disruptive to immersion. And instead it makes those feelings part of the fiction that they're participating in. It's another way of asking a question which the player already knows the answer to. They have a gut reaction answer ready to go, and that answer brings them further into the fiction. This is what I mean when I say that in AR narratives in the real world, we have to deal with the player and the protagonist as the same person. It doesn't just mean telling the player who they should be role-playing as, giving them a persona. We have to meet them halfway. Their feelings, including their feelings of embarrassment or foot hurting, are hard for them to ignore, and we ignore them at our peril. When we move AR and gameplay and narrative out into the real world, onto the real street, we can't demand total suspension of disbelief from our players before we let them play the game. Because in AR layers, 90% of what the player experiences is the real world. Much of that experience is their real selves. There's no point trying to tell the player you're not playing it right, because when the player is the protagonist, what you're really saying is, you're not right. You're saying, you're not in the right kind of body to play this. You're excluding them, you're denying them. In AR, we can't try to overwrite who the player is, any more than we can try to tell you that you're standing in a dragon's cave when you're not. In AR role-playing, you can either deny reality to overwrite it, or you can augment it. More importantly, you can either deny the player's reality, or you can augment it. You can't do both. Augmentation is not overwriting. It's addition. It's cooperation. Because asking players to ignore what's going on with them is asking them to ignore parts of their reality. That limits the amount of reality available to us as storytellers to augment. And we're missing an opportunity to surprise the player by inviting and responding to feelings they think they're hiding, feelings which normally don't have any place in fiction. The same feelings that give a ring of authenticity to really good characters, like self-consciousness. Suddenly, you're allowing them to be their own protagonist. It's just like when the player says, "I have a deflector shield." Bing! There's nothing inherently wrong with that bit of imagination, suddenly introducing a deflector shield. Oh, I guess we're in a sci-fi setting after all. It's world building. The player's imaginatively contributing to the play, but the player came up with the shield because they didn't want to get shot. They role-played in order to get something they want. And I think that can be a powerful thing. That shows us how we can use what the player wants to help them turn themselves into protagonists, as long as we make room in the story for what they're feeling, give them a way for their emotional journey to be part of their hero's journey. That doesn't always mean giving the player what they want, and in fact, we've had success with embarrassing the player, whether that's by giving them a hostile, rebuffing encounter from an actor, or dramatizing a sexual encounter in the toilets during a busy festival. Not this one, don't worry. That was fun, though. Ugh. But the fiction made space for those feelings. So we're starting to figure out how players relate to digital narratives in real environments. But because of the doofus factor, that relationship to the narrative can all too easily be disrupted by the social context around them, by other people. But if you do it right, the presence of other people around the player can also enhance their experience. While you're trying to get players to feel adventurous in real-world spaces, festivals, public places, you also need to help many of them get past the worry, the chance, however small, the fear shared by all nerds, really by anyone who plays imagination games, the fear that they will be heckled by jocks. So we had to work out how to make self-consciousness a virtue in our AR layers. We had to find new ways of doing it, like giving our players the opportunity to look cool in front of other people. And one of the ways we do this is to create FOMO, fear of missing out. There's nothing that creates FOMO like a velvet rope. So you saw in the video our bouncer character wearing sunglasses. This is a character who not only provides a gate in our gameplay. Once the player has found the appropriate password in the digital layer, they can verbally give the password in the hard layer and get access to the VIP area. But that VIP area is not accessible to anybody who isn't running our experience. So in the middle of a busy festival, we've created a purely exclusive environment that everyone who doesn't have one of our bright green Playlines branded pairs of headphones on looks at and goes, those people know something that I don't. How do I get in there? And the only answer is that you have to run one of our experiences. Most of immersive theater is fueled by FOMO, fear of missing out, because a larger possibility space than a single user can see prompts replay and a sense of reality. Hero moments, where the player gets a unique, visible place in the immersive theater story, can increase engagement, but sometimes it comes at the cost of immersion for other players, because people begin to game your story, to treat it as a vending machine for story moments. And so after our players get through the red rope, they enter a dance area. It's kind of like a silent disco. It's full of other players. We move them from the end of their solo, unique, player-directed, highly consequential journey in audio, where we've been speaking directly to them, and we suddenly move them out into a public space where everybody is listening to the same music channel, even if they're surrounded by different digital characters. Because we like moving from the private to the public, because it brings the players out of their shell even more and gives them a community experience of the adventure that they've just had. Now, in his book about working and designing themed entertainment, Ron Schneider, The Dream Finder, he describes the history of arguably the first theme park, Coney Island in New York. First, there was Steeplechase Park. It was a collection of rides and attractions with no particular theming, like a traditional fairground. Then there was Luna Park. The rides told a story, like the Great Chicago Fire or Journey to the Moon, but they were all jumbled together with no unifying theme. In Ron's words, guests were slammed from one reality to the next. And finally, there came Dreamland, an architectural setting inspired by Arabian Nights. And although it's kind of a cacophony of appropriation, it was a unified setting for stories and adventures where the player didn't leave the setting as they moved from activity to activity. And as AR allows us to start bringing gameplay into the real world, whether that's static, single-room hologram experiences, site-specific installations like Playlines work, or location-agnostic experiences like POKÉMON Go, I think we need to figure out how to create stories that the player wants to help tell. Open worlds of story content that can guide players between locations, between activities, whether that's their grocery run or a series of rides or a series of escape rooms, between different levels of reality, without them ever leaving the story. because it's a story that they're telling themselves. Now, if you're a business owner, does the proliferation of AR layers, does the possibility of tagging your local environment mean you'll lose control of your spaces? Well, in the digital layer, yes. Will people be able to graffiti over your commercial frontage in some ways, at some levels, digitally augmenting things in a way that you might never be aware of? Yes. The idea of trying to stop happening will soon be as old-fashioned as the idea of trying to stop people taking photos in a museum. You can try, but you're competing with humanity's collective capacity for mischief. And more importantly, you're missing a chance to understand what it is that keeps bringing people back to galleries, even though they've already seen a photo of the Mona Lisa. Because places, and taking people places, and giving them experiences in places, really matters. If you own a cultural space, you might be about to find you have little control of the digital utterances which are starting to be inscribed on that space. But there's also never been a more exciting time for spaces to become multi-context, with different visitors and different audiences able to use the same space as a gig, a narrative, a LARP, a scavenger hunt, a canvas, all seamlessly and simultaneously. Does there need to be some control? Yes, because no one has the right to walk down your street and scrawl a digital swastika on your house, whether they do it in a layer or not. But I think it would be a mistake to try to confine the tools, to try to confine the ability to inscribe on the public digital layer to official channels, to leave it in the hands of the self-appointed, because that would mean essentially handing over monopolistic control of digital public space to the same monolithic structures that we handed over control of public space in the real layer to the highest bidder. Advertising dominates our world, and pretty soon, digital layers that might contain advertising will be available on every street corner. But is that all that's going to be available? The promise of AR, ultimately, is the ability to customize how we see the world. But what we need to avoid is allowing this technology just to give more power to the powerful, because there are already plenty of people who can pick and choose and customize their reality. Ultimately, the promise of AR is for us to be able to leave each other notes in the margins of reality. But that makes it more important than ever to make those tools available to the marginalized. Which is why I believe that learning to tell stories in this medium, the hardest medium of all, in my opinion, reality, is important because story is something that unites us, despite the fundamental separation caused by our inability to share exactly how we each see the world. Narrative is the universal language that we developed so we could compare notes about our disparate experiences of reality. And as soon as we start working with reality as our medium, we have a responsibility to reality, because some people's realities are harsher than others. In real life, everyone is their own protagonist. But games and fiction generally define and specify who protagonists are and can be, and we tend to see the same kinds of protagonists coming up all the time. But not everyone gets to be the kind of protagonist we typically see in games. In games, some people get to be more protagonists than others. But in AR, if you exclude the kind of person the player is from the story, then you're missing out on the opportunity to play with them. And that's the only way to construct meaning in AR, brick by brick, emotion by emotion, back and forth. In AR, the player is already embodied in your setting. They're standing there waiting to be part of the story. And if you don't let them, if you keep insisting who they should be, if you keep telling them that they can only play it your way, then you might find yourself 6 years old again, playing an imagination game, taking careful aim, and firing your imaginary gun, and finding there's no one there. And that's where I want to leave it. Thank you very much. Anybody want to stick out? Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Hello.
So I own an escape room, and I'm really interested.
Sorry, go right into the mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I own an escape room, and I'm interested in integrating some AR into my rooms. Do you feel like that there's a space that's too small, a physical space that's too small for AR?
I think it's a good question. I think that's like asking, so the question was, is there a space that's too small, using escape rooms as an example? I think that's like asking if there is such a thing as too small a story. And I think it's about, this job of story is to effectively fill whatever the dimensions of the space is with the right amount of narrative. So if it's like that Hemingway short story about the shoes, that's fine too, you know? So no, I don't think so. And I think that AR is all about adding an extra dimension, whether that's threat or affection or warmth. In principle, definitely not. And it's an area that I'm interested in as well, and I think there's a lot of potential there. But I also think that one of the potential areas where AR could contribute is actually extending the dimensions of the space digitally so that the puzzle and the story might begin before you even get to the escape room and follow you home to the train station. Questions? I'm probably going to be doing a breakout after this if we don't get to everybody. I don't know where the breakout room is. I'm sure I'll find out. But just stick around afterwards. Hi.
Hi. You talked about Ron Schneider and
Yes.
kind of the theme parks and themed entertainment as immersive entertainment and storytelling. And I was wondering, in your experience with AR, how much does the design of the actual physical environment that you're in affect the story experience, and how much of like for you as a writer for AR, how much of it goes into like when creating experience, how much goes into designing the actual environment and changing that,
Yeah.
and how much of it is like in whatever digital layer you're working with.
So the question is, how much do we design the spaces and what impact does that have on the digital layer of storytelling? Actually, in practice, most of the jobs that we've done so far as part of Playlines have been with relatively minimal set dressing because we do it within existing spaces. So we'll take a museum or a cultural center or a park. And the idea is to not try to alter too much because I'm interested in recontextualizing that environment. So we use what our co-founder Dustin Freeman describes as reverse level design, where in conventional level design, you have the beats, you have the story you want to tell, and you build the environment. We start from the environment, and we work out the story from that place based on the opportunities that we see. Is there a natural fork in the environment for a decision? Is there a cool landmark or a nice little nook we can tuck players into to have an intimate experience? So a lot of what we currently do is reflecting on that, but that's also partly because those types of projects don't have the budget for a lot of on-site set dressing, and also because they tend to be while creating an additional digital layer while the site is also in normal use. So we can't have too much of a physical footprint. I would love to set dress full environments because I want to do Shakespeare in this format, you know? But I think that will come as more spaces become interested in putting this sort of thing on. But it's, again, this ties up with the idea of doing it within an escape room, where the more you can control the environment, the more that you can reflect that back to the player and get the player doing something specific. But that it doesn't have to work that way if the story fits the environment correctly.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Hi.
Sort of similar question, but you mentioned some physical limitations people might feel while they're playing. For example, their phone battery dying or their feet being tired. Do you factor any of those into the narrative that you're designing?
Yes. So if you're playing Pokemon Go and you see a Pokemon on the other side of a chain link fence and you can't get to it, or it's up a flight of stairs and you happen not to be able to get up those stairs, the game is still functioning as designed. That's not strictly a bug. That's a bug of reality that has been ported into the game. And so the limitations that people experience, whatever those are, trying to make sense of them and allow people to still access the story is really important, because otherwise you're just replicating the unfairnesses of reality. So, I mean, it's a rather extreme example, but we've designed in storylines with parallel routes to make the same route both accessible via the stairs and accessible via the elevator, and had slightly different content in the elevator or an Easter egg or something. So accessibility-wise, we try to stick with what the venue can do and to enhance and add richness and make that part of the experience. I mean, the issue of the battery starting to beep, I can foresee a time when we might procedurally ping in a piece of audio that tells players that their power pack is dying. Okay. It's an interesting one. That's worth further thought, I suspect. It's a good question, though. I'm afraid I think that's all the time that we have. Thank you very much. Fill out your speaker evaluations. Have a great time, and I'll find out where the breakout is. Thank you.